November the 4th, 1791. The banks of the Wabash River, Northwest Territory, what is now western Ohio. Just before dawn, a United States Army camp sits in a shallow clearing surrounded by dense forest. Nearly 1,000 soldiers, regular infantry and raw militia, most of them barely trained, huddle around dying campfires in the freezing November air. Their commander, General Arthur St. Clair, 55 years old, riddled with gout so severe he can barely mount his horse, has marched these men deep into territory that no American army has entered before. He has no idea that in the tree line surrounding his camp on three sides, over 1,000 warriors from the most powerful Native American military alliance ever assembled on this continent are waiting in absolute silence for the sun to rise. In approximately 3 hours, this clearing will become the site of the worst military defeat in United States history. More American soldiers will fall here in a single morning than in any battle against Native forces before or after. More than double the losses at Little Bighorn 85 years later. A disaster so complete that the United States government will try to bury it from public memory, and it will work. Almost nobody today knows it happened. To understand how nearly 1,000 American soldiers walked into the most devastating ambush on the continent, you have to understand what the Northwest Territory meant in 1791. The Revolutionary War had ended 8 years earlier. The new United States claimed everything between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. On paper, it belonged to America. On the ground, it belonged to the people who had lived there for centuries. The Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, the Wyandot, the Ojibwe, and a dozen other nations occupied what is now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. They had watched American settlers push across the mountains in growing numbers, farms carved out of hunting grounds, villages built on sacred land, treaties signed and broken before the ink dried. By 1790, a confederation of native nations had formed under two extraordinary military leaders, Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. Together they commanded a fighting force drawn from tribes across the entire Great Lakes region. In October 1790, President Washington sent General Josiah Harmar with 1,500 men to crush the Confederation. Little Turtle destroyed Harmar's force in 2 separate engagements, inflicting over 200 casualties and sending the survivors stumbling back to Fort Washington in humiliation. Washington was furious. The new nation could not afford to appear weak on its own frontier. He needed a decisive victory. He chose Arthur St. Clair, Revolutionary War veteran, President of the Continental Congress, Governor of the Northwest Territory, a man with an impressive title on every line of his record but no experience commanding large forces in wilderness combat. St. Clair was given 2,000 men and orders to march north from Fort Washington, present-day Cincinnati, build a chain of forts, and destroy the native confederation once and for all. The problem started before the army moved a single mile. Congress had authorized the troops, but refused to properly fund them. The War Department contracted supplies through private agents who delivered rotten food, defective gunpowder, and muskets that misfired in wet conditions. Uniforms were threadbare. Pay was months behind. St. Clair's force was a mix of 2 small regular infantry regiments and a large body of militia recruited from the Kentucky frontier. The regulars had minimal training. The militia had almost none. Many had never fired a volley in formation. Secretary of War Henry Knox sent St. Clair written instructions that included one critical warning. Above all, beware of surprise. He emphasized it twice. St. Clair marched north on October the 4th, 1791. From the first day, the campaign fell apart. The army moved at a crawl, barely 5 miles per day through dense forest. Men deserted in groups of 20 and 30 at a time. By the time St. Clair reached the headwaters of the Wabash River on November the 3rd, his force had shrunk from 2,000 to roughly 1,000 effective soldiers. That evening, He made camp in a narrow clearing on a slight rise above the river. The militia was placed across the creek about 300 yards ahead of the main camp as a forward guard. St. Clair did not order his men to build defensive fortifications. No breastworks, no sharpened stakes, no trenches, just open ground in the middle of hostile territory. He also failed to send adequate scouting parties into the surrounding forest. In those woods, watching every move the Americans made, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket had assembled approximately 1,000 warriors from at least a dozen nations. They had tracked St. Clair's column for days, watching the desertions, studying the formation, waiting for the perfect moment. They chose dawn on November the 4th. The attack came just as the first gray light filtered through the trees. Over 1,000 warriors hit the militia camp north of the creek simultaneously from 3 sides. The militia, untrained and completely unprepared, collapsed in minutes. Men ran without firing a shot, streaming back across the creek into the main camp and spreading panic through the regular infantry lines. Within moments, the main camp was surrounded. Warriors firing from behind trees poured accurate rifle fire into the packed American formation from every direction. St. Clair's men were bunched together in the open with no cover, no fortifications, and no clear targets to shoot back at. The American artillery crews tried to respond. They managed to bring several cannons into action, but native marksmen had identified the officers and gunners as priority targets. Artillery crews were picked off with terrifying precision. Within the first hour, nearly every cannon had gone silent. St. Clair, despite being so ill he had to be lifted onto his horse, rode through the chaos, trying to organize resistance. Musket rounds tore through his clothing. One grazed his head. His hair was singed by a passing round. 8 rounds passed through his coat and hat during the battle. Somehow none found flesh. He ordered bayonet charges to push the warriors back from the perimeter. The charges would drive into the tree line, the warriors would fall back, then close in again the moment the exhausted soldiers returned to camp. Each charge cost more men with no permanent gain. The battle raged for nearly 3 hours. By mid-morning, the situation was beyond recovery. Bodies covered the clearing. Wounded soldiers lay in rows with no one to treat them. Ammunition was running critically low. St. Clair made the only decision left: retreat. He ordered a bayonet charge toward the south, the only direction the encirclement seemed weakest. What remained of the army surged through the gap and ran. It was not an organized withdrawal. It was a complete rout. Men threw away their weapons, their packs, everything that slowed them down, and ran for their lives. The retreat covered nearly 30 miles back to Fort Jefferson. Warriors pursued for several miles before breaking off. When the survivors were finally counted, the numbers were staggering. Of roughly 1,000 soldiers engaged, over 630 had fallen in the battle. Another 260 were severely wounded. Nearly 200 camp followers, many of them soldiers' families, were also lost. Of the 920 or so who marched into that clearing at dawn, fewer than 500 walked out. The casualty rate exceeded 90%. To put that in perspective, Custer lost 268 men at Little Bighorn in 1876. St. Clair lost more than double that number 85 years earlier. In proportional terms, it remains the single worst defeat ever suffered by the United States Army. When the news reached Philadelphia, President Washington reportedly lost his composure entirely. Accounts describe one of the only moments in Washington's public life where he lost control of his famous temper. He condemned St. Clair's failure to follow the most basic military principles. A congressional investigation followed, the first in American history. St. Clair was cleared of criminal wrongdoing, but his military reputation was destroyed. He resigned his commission and spent the rest of his life in poverty. But here is what nobody tells you. Little Turtle and Blue Jacket didn't just win a battle. They executed one of the most tactically sophisticated operations in the history of warfare on this continent: the three-sided envelopment at dawn. The deliberate targeting of artillery crews and officers, the psychological destruction of the militia to create chaos before engaging the regulars. The controlled fallback during bayonet charges followed by immediate re-engagement. These were not random actions. This was coordinated military planning at the highest level. Little Turtle had studied American tactics during the Harmar campaign. He understood their reliance on artillery and officer leadership. He built his entire battle plan around eliminating both in the opening minutes, and it worked perfectly. The United States responded by sending General Mad Anthony Wayne, the most aggressive combat commander in the American military, with a properly trained, properly supplied force of 3,000 men. Wayne spent 2 full years training his army before marching north. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794, Wayne defeated the Confederation and forced the Treaty of Greenville, which opened Ohio to American settlement. But the defeat on the Wabash should have been the warning that changed how the United States treated its western frontier. Instead, it was buried. The same patterns of underestimating native military capability, sending poorly trained forces into unfamiliar territory, and ignoring the tactical intelligence of indigenous commanders would repeat themselves for another century, all the way to Little Bighorn. The worst military defeat in American history happened in a clearing in Ohio on a cold November morning in 1791. Over 630 American soldiers fell in less than 3 hours to a fighting force they never saw coming and never understood. The general who led them there could barely sit on his horse. The warriors who destroyed them executed a battle plan that military academics would study for generations if anyone bothered to teach it. But almost nobody does, and that might be the most telling part of the whole story.